I used to go camping alone a lot. It was my way of clearing my head after long work weeks, being away from people and phone signals. I'd drive out to the forest, pick a random trail on the map, and hike until I found a good spot to set up camp. It always felt safe enough. I'd done it for years without anything strange happening. But the trip I took in late September 2021 changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. I went to the San Juan National Forest in Colorado, somewhere off a small service road that wasn't marked on most maps. I had checked a few hiking forums before leaving and found mention of an unmarked trail that led to a quiet lake about 3 miles in. Most people said it was beautiful but overgrown, and not many hikers went there anymore. That sounded perfect to me. When I got to the starting point, I parked my truck near a patch of tall pines and loaded up my pack. It was around noon, clear skies, no wind. The first mile of the trail was easy, just uneven ground and some fallen branches. After that, it got dense and harder to follow. At one point I thought I had lost the path, but then I saw an old wooden marker nailed to a tree with a faint arrow burned into it. The wood was cracked and gray, but it pointed uphill, so I followed. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was getting low. The water was still, surrounded by trees that looked like they hadn't seen people in years. I set up my small one-person tent near the treeline, not too close to the water, and started a fire with some dry wood. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for crickets. I made some instant noodles, watched the lake for a while, and turned in early. It was completely dark by 8. I woke up sometime in the night, maybe around 2. It was cold enough that my breath fogged up inside the tent. I remember rolling over and hearing something faint outside, like footsteps on dry leaves. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer. But after a few seconds, I realized it sounded too slow and steady. Not the kind of rhythm animals make. It was like someone carefully stepping, then stopping, then stepping again. I stayed still for a while, trying to listen. The footsteps seemed to come from the side near the lake. Then they stopped altogether. The forest went silent. I waited maybe 5 minutes, then told myself it was nothing, maybe branches falling or the sound echoing off the water. I tried to sleep again, but I never really did. In the morning, I stepped outside to check around. Nothing was out of place. My gear was where I left it, and there were no tracks near the tent. I brushed it off, boiled water for coffee, and decided to hike around the lake before packing up. On the far side of the lake, there was a clearing I hadn't noticed before. It looked like someone had tried to set up a fire pit there a long time ago, just a ring of blackened stones and some half-burned logs. Then I saw something that made me uneasy. Near the edge of that clearing, leaning against a fallen tree, was a single hiking boot. It looked old, cracked leather, covered in moss. I almost left it alone, but curiosity got me. I picked it up and saw that the sole had been torn halfway off, and there was still a dark, stiff piece of sock inside. It was probably just some lost hiker's gear, but the way it was positioned, like someone had set it there, felt wrong. That afternoon, I decided not to stay another night. The place didn't feel the same anymore. I started hiking back toward my truck, following the faint markers again. About halfway down, I realized something else that threw me off. The wooden marker I'd followed up the hill the day before was gone. The nail was still in the tree, but the piece of wood was missing. I figured maybe it had fallen or been pulled down by wind. Still, I got turned around twice trying to find the right direction. The forest started to feel tighter, like every tree looked the same. After an hour of walking, I saw something up ahead that stopped me cold. There was a man standing in the clearing about 50 yards ahead, wearing a faded green jacket and dark pants. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, facing away from me. At first, I thought maybe he was another camper or a ranger, but there was something off about how he stood. His arms were straight at his sides, and his head was tilted slightly like he was listening. I didn't want to shout, so I quietly stepped off the trail and crouched behind a fallen log. After maybe 20 seconds, he slowly turned his head, not his body, just his head, and looked right in my direction. I froze. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was staring straight at me. We stayed like that for maybe half a minute. Then he turned and walked deeper into the woods, slow and deliberate. I didn't follow. I waited until I couldn't hear anything, then got back on the path and walked as fast as I could in the direction I thought led back to the truck. I reached the vehicle around sunset. I didn't look back once while packing up. Before leaving, I glanced down the road one last time and saw movement between the trees, someone standing far off, barely visible. I couldn't tell if it was the same man, but he wasn't moving, just standing again like before. I got in the truck and drove without stopping until I hit a main road. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel in Durango. I told myself it was probably some other hiker, maybe even someone who lived off-grid. But I've been camping for years, and that kind of stillness, that kind of watching, it wasn't normal. A month later, I looked up reports from that area out of curiosity. There were a few mentions on older forums about people going missing near unmarked trails in the San Juan forest back in the early 2000s. One post said search teams had found scattered belongings near a lake that wasn't officially listed. No bodies, just empty campsites, torn tents, and personal gear left behind. I haven't gone camping alone since then. When I do go now, I stay in public campgrounds where I can hear other people around me. I still think about that man sometimes, how quiet he was, and how he seemed to know exactly where I was, even without seeing me move. I can't prove what I saw. Maybe it was just a person living out there, maybe not. In 2017, two friends and I, Mark and Devin, decided to go on a weekend camping trip deep inside a part of Oregon called Cinder Hollow. It's an old volcanic basin surrounded by dense pine forest and sharp ridges. Not many people camp there anymore because the access road is rough and the ground is uneven from old lava rock. But that was the point. We wanted isolation. We left early on a Friday, packed light, and took Mark's old Jeep up the Forest Service road until it narrowed into a dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Around late afternoon, we found a clearing near a slope that overlooked the basin. It wasn't an official campsite, but there was an old fire ring and some level ground for our tents. We parked the Jeep nearby, set up, and spent the evening cooking hot dogs and talking about work. Everything felt calm until after dark. The woods there get quiet, completely silent. Not the usual mix of crickets and wind, just stillness. Around 10, Devin mentioned he kept hearing what sounded like a single heavy footstep every now and then, always from different spots around camp. We all stopped talking to listen, but nothing happened after that, so we brushed it off. The next morning, we decided to hike down into the basin to see what was left of the old volcanic field. It was about 2 miles downhill through dense pine, and the air got colder the farther we went. About halfway down, we found a circle of trees that didn't look natural. They were blackened at the base, like something had burned them years ago, and the trunks bent slightly inward toward a patch of open ground in the middle. No plants grew there, not even moss. The soil looked dark and wet, even though it hadn't rained for days. Devin kicked at the dirt and said it smelled like sulfur. I didn't smell anything, but the area gave me a headache, so I told them we should move on. We stayed about another minute, then kept walking until we reached the bottom of the basin. The ground down there was strange, soft in some places, brittle in others, like walking on packed ash. We found old campfire stones scattered around, half buried. Mark guessed that people used to camp there before the state closed it off. We explored for a while, took pictures, and then started heading back up the ridge before sunset. That's when things started to feel wrong. About halfway up the trail, Devin suddenly stopped and said, Did either of you see someone standing by the trees just now?" We looked where he pointed. Nothing but shadows. He swore he saw movement behind us, someone stepping out from between the trunks, then ducking back. Mark laughed it off, but I could tell Devin wasn't joking. We pushed on. Around 30 minutes later, Mark realized he'd dropped his small GPS tracker somewhere along the trail. He wanted to go back for it since it was expensive. Devin said we should leave it, but Mark insisted. I told him I'd go with him while Devin went ahead to the camp, so he wouldn't have to wait around in the dark. We agreed to meet back in about an hour. Mark and I retraced our steps down the slope. The light was fading fast, and the forest looked completely different. The deeper we went, the quieter it got again. No birds, no insects, not even wind. About 10 minutes in, Mark found the GPS lying near a dead log. He picked it up, checked it, and said we could head back. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints on the trail ahead of us, but they weren't ours. The tread looked deep, like from heavy boots, and the spacing was strange, too wide for a normal stride. They went in the same direction we were walking. We followed them for about 50 feet until they veered off into the trees. Mark joked that maybe Devin had circled around, but the prints were bigger than his. We hurried back up toward camp. It got darker than I expected. The ridge blocked most of the evening light, and by the time we reached the clearing, we could only see the glow of the campfire Devin must have started. But when we stepped in, the fire was low, and Devin wasn't there. His tent was zipped, his backpack was on the ground, but there was no sign of him. We called his name a few times, no answer. After 5 minutes, Mark started to worry. He thought Devin might have gone to use the bathroom in the woods, but the silence made it feel different. We walked a short distance beyond the camp, shining our flashlights between the trees. About 30 yards away, I saw something white against the dark ground. It was one of Devin's shoes, sitting upright like he'd stepped out of it. We looked around for the other, but couldn't find it. Then faintly we heard a branch snap farther down the slope, maybe 50 yards off. Mark called out again, but there was no response. The firelight flickered behind us, and for the first time, I noticed the air smelled faintly like sulfur again. It made my eyes water. I told Mark we should get back to camp, wait a bit, and if Devin didn't show, we'd leave. He agreed. Back at the fire, we sat quietly. The woods stayed completely still. Every so often, we'd hear a dull thud or faint rustle from far off, but never close enough to pinpoint. Around midnight, Mark decided to check Devin's tent again. He unzipped it slowly, turned on his flashlight, and froze. Inside the tent were Devin's sleeping bag and gear, but the bag looked flattened, like something heavy had been pressed on it. The weird part was the ground underneath. It looked darker than the rest, like damp soil, even though we were camped on dry rock. When he lifted the edge of the bag, there was a strong smell of sulfur again. That was it for us. We packed what we could, left Devin's stuff behind, and drove out. It took nearly an hour just to get back to the main road because the Jeep's headlights kept flickering and the engine stuttered twice. We finally reached cell service around 3 in the morning and called the local sheriff's office to report what happened. Search teams went out the next day. They found Devin's shoe and some disturbed ground near that burned ring of trees we'd seen earlier, but no trace of him. The sheriff said they'd keep looking, but weeks passed and nothing came of it. His family eventually held a small service. A few months later, Mark told me he went back on his own, trying to find some kind of closure. He said he didn't go all the way down, just far enough to see the basin again. According to him, the place looked different, like the ground had caved in near the center where we'd walked before. He saw what looked like a hole or pit about 10 feet across, black and perfectly round. He didn't stay to look longer. To this day, Devin's never been found. Every now and then, I still think about that sound we heard at night, those single, heavy footsteps. I try to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a bear moving oddly, or the ground settling. But when I remember the smell, the footprints, and the way the forest seemed to hold its breath, I can't quite convince myself. There's one last detail I've never told anyone outside of Mark. About a week after the search ended, I got a text from Devin's number. It just said, "Still here." No location, no follow-up. When I tried to call, the number was disconnected. I deleted the message, but sometimes when I think about that night, I can almost smell the sulfur again. In 2020, I took a temporary job as a seasonal ranger assistant in northern Idaho. Most of the work was routine, checking fire risks, clearing trails, helping lost hikers. But there was one station they warned us about during training, Bear Creek Lookout. It was an old fire tower built back in the 1950s, deep in the forest about 20 miles from the nearest road. The senior ranger, Mitchell, said it hadn't been staffed in years because of maintenance issues, but occasionally someone had to check on it for structural safety and vandalism. Around late September, I drew that assignment. It was supposed to be a simple one-night inspection. Go up, stay overnight, log any damage, then hike out in the morning. Mitchell handed me the key for the gate and said, "Don't stay up there longer than you have to." I thought he was joking, but he didn't smile when he said it. The road up to the tower was in bad shape. Fallen trees, overgrown brush, and erosion had eaten half of it away. I parked where it ended and continued on foot for about 3 miles until I saw the metal structure rising above the treeline. The tower looked solid from a distance, but the closer I got, the worse it appeared: rusted bolts, cracked planks, peeling paint. The wind-up there made a low hum through the guy wires. Inside the small cabin at the top, there was an old cot, a desk, and a rusted stove. I set down my pack, logged my arrival time, and started noting what needed repairs. Most of the work was cosmetic, though the north railing had come loose. Around evening, I made a small fire in the pit below the tower, cooked a can of chili, and sat there watching the trees turn darker as the sun dipped. It felt peaceful until it didn't. Sometime after dark, I noticed a light flickering in the distance down the slope, like a lantern or flashlight moving slowly between trees. There weren't supposed to be any hikers out there. That area wasn't open to the public. I figured maybe someone got lost, so I grabbed my flashlight and started down the narrow trail leading away from the tower. After about 5 minutes of walking, the light stopped moving. I called out but got no answer. I went another 50 yards and found something on the ground, a small metal thermos, dented and half buried in leaves. When I picked it up, it was cold but not dirty, like it hadn't been there long. There were initials carved into the side, HL. I turned around to head back, but now I couldn't see the tower light through the trees. I tried to retrace my steps, but somehow the trail split, and I couldn't tell which way I'd come. I followed what I thought was the right direction until I saw a clearing ahead. For a second I thought I'd made it back, but when I stepped out, I realized it wasn't the lookout. It was a camp, or what used to be one. There were 2 collapsed tents, a half-burned fire ring, and a few scattered items, an enamel mug, a pair of socks, and an old camping stove. Everything was covered in a thin layer of ash and pine needles. It looked abandoned for years, but the weird part was how the gear was positioned. The tents weren't packed up or torn by animals. They looked like the people inside had just stepped out and never came back. I turned to leave, but then I heard movement, a slow shuffle, maybe 30 or 40 feet behind me. I swung my light that way, and for a split second, I saw someone standing between the trees. A tall man, or at least shaped like one, but his clothes looked wrong. They weren't modern, more like faded wool and canvas, the kind you'd see in old logging photos. Before I could say anything, he moved behind a tree and disappeared. I ran. Not fast, just steady enough to keep from tripping in the dark. When I finally saw the faint outline of the tower again, I didn't stop until I was inside and had bolted the door. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting by the window with my flashlight off, watching the tree line. Around midnight, I thought I saw the same flickering light again, lower down the slope. It stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, then faded out. In the morning, the forest looked normal again. I packed up early, logged what I saw in my field notes, but left out the part about the figure. I didn't want Mitchell thinking I was spooked. I started back down the trail to my truck. About a mile from the tower, I found something that stopped me. There, nailed to a pine tree at about eye level, was a small wooden board with 3 letters burned into it. HL, the same initials from the thermos. Back at base, I asked around. Mitchell said the tower used to be manned full-time decades ago. He mentioned a ranger named Henry Lawson, who went missing up there in 1978. The official story was that he slipped on wet rock while descending after a storm and fell into the ravine. They searched for weeks but never recovered the body. When I showed him the thermos, he looked uneasy and told me to log it as historical property and leave it in storage. I did, but a week later, when I went to check the storeroom, the thermos was gone. No one had signed it out. That winter, a storm knocked down part of the access road, and Bear Creek Lookout was closed off completely. The tower's supposed to be dismantled soon. I sometimes wonder what they'll find when they tear it down. There's one last thing I remember clearly. On my way out that morning, I turned once to look back. The top window of the lookout reflected the sunlight in a way that looked almost like a person standing inside. I know there shouldn't have been anyone up there, but the shape didn't move. It just stayed in the window until the trees hid it from view. I don't tell this story much because it sounds like a campfire tale when I say it out loud. Still, sometimes when I'm out in quiet woods, I think about that old lookout and how the forest around it seemed to be waiting, like it remembered something I didn't understand.